Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome. My name is Brent Sleep. I'm the Chair of Civil Engineering, and I'm also the Acting Director of the Lassonde Institute of Mining. I'd like to welcome everyone to the second talk in the Lassonde Institute Leaders in Mining series. It's great to see all the people here and see the great turnout. It's my great pleasure to introduce Mr. Bob Ray, who's come to speak to us today. He's going to present on corporate social responsibility and the Ring of Fire. It should be a great talk. I'm sure that Mr. Ray probably doesn't need a lot of introduction, but I'll just give you a brief bio. So he is currently a senior partner at Olthuis, Kleer, and Townshend, where he works with First Nations across Canada as legal counsel, advisor, and negotiator. Mr. Ray was elected 11 times to the House of Commons in the Ontario legislature between 1978 and 2008. He served as Ontario's 21st Premier from 1990 to 1995, and more recently as interim federal leader of the Liberal Party from 2011 to 2013. He was recently named a Companion of the Order of Canada in 2015. Mr. Ray also teaches here at the University of Toronto. He's also an alumnus of the University of Toronto and a Rhodes Scholar. He's currently a distinguished senior fellow in the School of Public Policy and Governance, and he's teaching 2 courses this term at the University of Toronto. He has written 5 books. His most recent book is titled What's Happened to Politics? A Conversation Canadians Have Been Waiting For. So please join me in welcoming Mr. Ray. So, thank you. Mr. Ray will be joined by Mr. Kyle Stanfield, who will act as the moderator for this talk. So we'll have a presentation from Mr. Ray and then a question and answer session afterwards that will be moderated by Mr. Stanfield. So Mr. Stanfield is a Director of Environment and Sustainability at New Gold. He has worked with Indigenous peoples in support of environmental management around the world, including West Africa, South and Central America, and Canada since 1997. He's collaborated with First Nations and Métis communities in Ontario, the Northwest Territories, and British Columbia. He recently managed the conclusion of a 3-year environmental assessment of the Rainy River Gold Mine in northwestern Ontario. This project involved working with 16 Aboriginal communities and 5 non-Aboriginal communities. So, thank you for being here, Mr. Stanfield. So it's your time to present now. Go ahead.
I'm up. Okay, good.
You're up.
Thank you so much, and thank you for the kind introduction, and thank you for the opportunity to speak to this gathering. It's, I hope, going to be very much a conversation. I will start the conversation, and Kyle will join in based on his significant experience in the industry, and then I hope that we'll have an opportunity for all of you. And I understand that the audience includes not only people in the industry, but also some faculty and I hope some students as well. I see some nodding going on. I hope that's not a portent of people falling asleep, but rather just a general agreement with what I'm about to say. It's a big topic, and I'm going to try to simplify it as much as I can. We need to start with a bit of history, although not so much as to cause increased somnolence, but to simply point out that in order to understand a little bit of the tension around public policy in Ontario and in Canada on issues of corporate social responsibility and resource development, we need to understand a little bit about differing views, or contested views, if you like, about the nature of the relationship between First Nations and other Canadians. From the perspective of the Crown, that's to say the governments of Canada, both federally and provincially, the legal position is still this, that wherever there is a treaty between First Nations and the government of Canada, lands have been ceded to the Crown by First Nations in exchange for the setting aside of some reserve land, and in exchange for the general principle that the Crown will take care of the people who have lived in this country for thousands of years. That is the Crown's position. In addition to that, the Crown accepts the fact that when the Constitution was brought home to Canada in 1982, the level of legal obligation on the Crown with respect to the relationship to First Nations was affirmed and recognized in the Constitution for the first time. This is what's called Section 35 of the Constitution. And since that time, the Supreme Court of Canada has developed a number of tests as to what exactly is the nature of that obligation. And it is those tests that people are now discussing, and I'll come to them in a minute, with respect to a duty to consult and a duty to accommodate those who are affected or impacted by resource development or frankly anything else that either the Crown or a company would want to do. To complete the picture, we also have to recognize that Canada is part of a global development, which essentially is, for all intents and purposes, comes down to two central issues. The first is the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, which was adopted by the United Nations relatively recently, and which was also accepted by Canada. Canada was a signatory, although Canada said in signing that it was doing so without abandoning any of the sovereign rights of the government of Canada with respect to the territory of Canada. But the fact remains that the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People sets out a rather extensive view with respect to the rights of Indigenous people, and in particular, and these are words to which we will return, the fact that development within the traditional territory of Indigenous people could not occur without the free, prior, and informed consent of the Indigenous people who are so impacted. That's called, in the way everything becomes lingo, FPIC. In addition to the Declaration, there's also a lot of work being done and carried out under the aegis of the United Nations, including United Nations financial institutions, the World Bank, the International Finance Corporation, all groups that are involved in looking more generally, more broadly, at development projects around the world. And there are a series of agreements and understandings which are being reached with the global mining industry. So there is, in this part of our life, as there is in all parts of our life, not only the question of our local laws, our provincial and federal laws, but also what international laws and agreements are we party to. And there will always be an argument about whether, to what extent international law is clear, binding, with respect to the conduct of either governments or corporations or First Nations in Canada. But without getting into the legal entrails of that debate, which we don't need to for all intents and purposes here, what we need to understand is that this is not exclusively a Canadian or Ontario or Northwestern Ontario debate. This is a discussion which has implications and issues that extend well beyond our borders and boundaries. And also the fact that many of the companies that are doing work in Canada are international companies that are actually doing work all around the world. So they're perfectly familiar with this question of the overall responsibility which they have, and secondly, the responsibility that governments have, both locally, provincially, and federally. It's important to understand this notion of jurisdiction being contested, because without that understanding, it's sometimes very difficult, very confusing, and hard to kind of get at some of the underlying issues which we face in Ontario and which we face in Canada more generally. Because for a long time, the Crown asserted this question of its jurisdiction without a great deal of legal challenge from anyone that was ever successful. And that has begun to change. It started really in 1974, when there was a famous Supreme Court of Canada decision, which we know as the Calder case, which was a case out of British Columbia that was begun by the chief of the Nisga'a Nation in the 1960s, and his advisor, legal advisor, was one Thomas Berger, a name which you may be familiar with in the whole area of resource development. He was the chairman of the commission that looked at the development of, potential development of a pipeline in the Northwest Territories in the 1970s, and went on to the Supreme Court of British Columbia, and then left the court, went back to being an advocate, and has continued in his advocacy until the present time. The Calder case stands for a simple proposition, and that is this. The chief asserted that in British Columbia, there was never a treaty on his land. None of his ancestors ever ceded the land to the Crown, and title to the land never passed to the Crown. And so his argument in front of the court was very simple. It was, we still own the land. It's still ours. We have something called Aboriginal title. We have title to the land as a result of our having occupied this land since time immemorial. And the court said, basically, we don't know whether or not you have title. We don't know whether or not you have Aboriginal title to this land. But what we do know is that the argument that the Crown has made, that title has been ceded simply by virtue of occupation and the creation of the government of British Columbia and the government of Canada, is actually wrong. And so this decision was truly revolutionary in its impact on the federal government, because the federal government and any province that did not have treaties was suddenly faced with the reality is, we don't actually know who owns this land. We think we do. The First Nations think they do, and we can't provide any degree of certainty. And the first province that actually went and came to grips with this was the province of Quebec. And to cut the historical narrative a little bit short, just to remind you that the three treaties, modern-day treaties, current-day treaties that have been negotiated with respect to regional government and to Aboriginal title and jurisdiction, and the certainty with which people can do business in the province of Quebec, in northern Quebec, is a direct result of the Calder decision and the fact that both levels of government realized that there was substantial uncertainty, and if the province wanted to develop its hydro resources, it simply had to make a deal. It had no choice but to make a deal. And so that leverage was suddenly there. And you know what? The first agreement, the first treaty, took a year to negotiate. It did not take 30 years to negotiate. It took a year. And it took a year because the province wanted to move ahead, and they realized that if they wanted to move ahead, they had to make a deal. So, in a sense, there's a checkerboard across the country. In some places, there are the old treaties, like Ontario. Most of Ontario is covered by a treaty with the exciting name of Treaty Number 9, Other provinces are covered by other treaty numbers. All treaties signed somewhere between 1875 and 1925, that 50-year period. And in British Columbia and Quebec and Northwest Territories and Yukon and Labrador, which are extensive areas of growth and potential investment for natural resources, there are a series of agreements, land claim discussions, a hodgepodge of governance arrangements which have been reached, some comprehensive, some much less comprehensive, but generally speaking, all advancing the principle that the First Nations will benefit from resource development, that the First Nations will receive revenues from resource development, that the First Nations will receive jobs from resource development, training from resource development, and that the environmental assessment process, which will control resource development, will have direct participation by First Nations. Those are all the elements that are in place, in addition to enhancing the degree of general self-government that is being provided to the First Nations. That's true in Labrador, it's true in Northwest Territories, it's true in Yukon, it's true in Quebec, it's true in Niska. So that's a clear direction of Canadian public policy. And so if you want to engage in mining activity in the Northwest Territories, the law is pretty clear. And the relationships that will be established are pretty clear. Nunavut just completed a comprehensive environmental review of a large mining project in northern Baffin Island. A very extensive project, very extensive review, extensive discussions about how it's going to be done, direct Aboriginal participation in the environmental process. They name people to the panel. The government's basically said this is a government-to-government relationship. We will cede and share responsibility for the development of this project, and here are the ways and means in which this will be done. For those of you who've been following along, where do we have an issue? Well, we have an issue in the provinces where the old treaties were signed, because there's a problem with the old treaties. The problem with the old treaties is the treaties in writing say First Nations gave up the land. They gave up title. They ceded title. They gave it away. And the Crown has relied on that for over 100 years. The problem is the First Nations themselves do not accept that that is the full expression of the nature of the treaty relationship that was established in 1905. One simple fact that leads to this sense of this is contested, what is the meaning of the treaty, is the fact that the people who, quote, signed the treaty couldn't read the treaty. The treaty was a written document which was presented to them, and they signed it the next day. There'd been a period of discussion about whether people wanted a treaty or not. But I think it's fair to say that the level of understanding and comprehension of what was being given up would probably not impress a modern-day court saying, yeah, that there was full understanding and full disclosure of what was in that document. And so the courts have come in and said, well, you need to accommodate, you meaning companies and governments, you need to consult. But there's still an ambiguity as to what exactly is that about, and how far exactly does that extend, and what exactly do we do as a result. Now, when time came in the Ring of Fire, huge potential mining discovery in an area that is due north of Nakina on Highway 11, east of Thunder Bay, northeast of Thunder Bay, northeast of Lake Nipigon, for those of you who are familiar with the geography. And it's an extensive find. It's a very dramatic find, particularly with respect to chromium deposits, but not just chromite. It also has to do with a whole other range of minerals. And quite frankly, we don't fully know yet what the full potential, what the full development potential of the area is. Of course, as in all mining developments, governments and companies and everybody has said it's worth billions, it's worth tens of billions. No, it's worth hundreds of billions. Anyway, the point is it's an exciting potential development. Claims were in the name of a company by the name of Cliffs Natural Resources, a large American company doing business in Canada. They had extensive, at one time, had extensive iron ore properties in northern Quebec and in Newfoundland, in Labrador. And the First Nations came together in what's called the Matawa Tribal Council, 9 First Nations, and said to the world, to the government of Ontario, to the government of Canada, and to Cliffs, wait a minute. This is all in our traditional territory. We have to be part of this process, whatever it is you're planning to do. It potentially, if the project goes ahead as proposed by Cliffs, and at one point fully acceded to by Ontario, there'll be a large transportation corridor going down the center of our territory. It will cross 3 major river systems. It will impact our traditional territory in a whole variety of ways. It will impact all of our traditional, not only burying grounds, but places where people hunt and places where people fish. And besides all that, this land is our land. It's not simply your land. We're prepared to share it with you, but we're not prepared to give it up entirely and say, you can go ahead and do whatever you want. We'll simply appear in front of an environmental assessment panel, and that'll be the end of it. And so there's been a steady movement by the First Nations to say we have a series of things which we want to put in place. We're not saying that we are inherently opposed to the development. What we are opposed to is being marginalized by this industrial process. We insist on being part of the environmental assessment process, as has taken place in other parts of Canada. We insist on getting direct benefit from any development that takes place. We insist on improvements in infrastructure taking place for us as much as they take place for the companies. And we insist on conditions in our communities improving. There are 5 remote communities in the Matawa Tribal Council. There are no year-round roads to those communities. They are only accessible by road in the wintertime. Oh, and by the way, the season is getting shorter and shorter, and it's much less a certain means of transportation. As a result of that isolation, there are many, many social and other practical economic issues that arise. And we expect, the view is expressed by First Nations, they say, we expect our concerns to be addressed by the Government of Ontario and by the Government of Canada. And yes, we expect them to be addressed by the companies which wish to do business in our traditional territory. And so that's where matters now stand. But of course, you will all be aware, there's this thing called the global economy out there. And there's a reality that commodity markets have gone into the tank, that Cliffs announced that it was abandoning its claims, or going to sell its claims, which they did. Cliffs, in addition, has sold all of its interests in the rest of Canada and is dramatically downsized in terms of its overall position in world markets. Every mining company in the world is engaging in a serious review of all of its activities, some of them laying off as many as 40, 50, even in one case 75% of its worldwide labor force in response to the dramatic fall in commodity prices, which has extended deeper and longer than a great many economists and other people had predicted. And so, who is doing business in the far north these days? It's not so much larger companies. There are some notable exceptions. Placer Dome, De Beers, there are some notable big company exceptions that are doing business. But by and large, it's junior mining companies, exploration companies, and the reality of consulting and accommodating and asking for consent to take it the next step is left now to a number of smaller companies that are not necessarily fully equipped to be able to engage at that level of activity, and certainly not when their own financing has been impacted by the nature of the worldwide recession. So the final point that I want to make is this. I think it's a fair criticism or comment to be made by the industry to say we're not entirely clear what the roadmap is. What are we supposed to do, and how are we supposed to do it? And I do think there's an obligation on the part of both the federal and the provincial governments to clarify where do we stand. Just to give you one example, the latest example. Mr. Trudeau accepted the 94 recommendations of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission when he received the report. He said, we accept the recommendations. Well, one of the recommendations that's made by Mr. Justice Sinclair is that the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People should now become the standard that should be applied to Canadian law with respect to this issue of consultation and full participation by First Nations in the possibilities of economic development. I would argue that this change is not as revolutionary or daunting as some might portray it, but I would also accept the argument that it at least means that provinces and the federal government have to make it clear what does the actual entrenchment of free, prior, and informed consent mean for resource development. And just to further complicate your lives, remember that resource development falls clearly within the jurisdiction of the province, and the overall relationship with First Nations people lies clearly in the jurisdiction of the federal government. So as a lawyer, I know I'm going to be busy for the next few years. I know it. I mean, I can feel it in my bones. This is going to be an area of enormous uncertainty unless governments and First Nations sit down and discuss what does this mean and how do we create the legal, social framework in which these kinds of responsibilities can be carried out and exercised by governments and by companies. You know, I've heard over the years, and I was mentioning this to some people recently, from companies that, you know, this brave new world of corporate social responsibility, we don't know what it means. And we don't know what to do. And we're not even sure we think it's what we're supposed to be doing. We're supposed to be responding to the shareholders, and that's our obligation. And these are all new things and newfangled ideas that really don't bear any relationship to what we'd like to be doing as companies. To which I would modestly reply, corporations have always had a social responsibility. Laws change and evolve over time. They have done over the last 300 or 400 years. And the best way to understand those responsibilities is that they're set out in the law. They're set out clearly and categorically, not as acts of charity on the part of a corporation, but as a responsibility that they have with respect to the environment, with respect to dealing with the impacts of whatever it is that they're proposing. The environmental assessment laws are very clear, and that is that in assessing the impact of a project, it is not simply about the social and economic impacts of a development on communities. And this is not just Canadian law or Ontario law. This is a general standard that's been established around the world. And I can remember and recall, as somebody who you'll respect from my biography, you know, I've been a rising star now in 6 decades, so you know, I've been around for quite a while. And I can certainly recall in my early days that there was huge resistance and debate in the mining industry about occupational health and safety, workers' compensation, workers' safety as we call it now, and questions of industrial standards and what levels of compensation and how should this be done, and the right to refuse dangerous work, and all the steps that were taken in Canada and the United States and around the world to enhance the rights of working people to deal with the pollution that was impacting their work environment and their situation. And one does not hear as much today about the absolutely dastardly impact that these laws will have on mining development in Canada. Why don't we? Because they've been generally accepted as part of what is an absolutely legitimate social responsibility on the part of a company. And if a company doesn't follow those, you will find yourselves in trouble, legally in trouble. It's part of your responsibility. This new, arguably, new, relatively speaking, preoccupation is, I predict, going to be generally accepted as the standard that will be followed and accepted by Canadian mining companies and by junior mining companies and by exploration companies and by people in the industry and by governments across the country. It's going to take some time and some persistence. Will it add to the cost of doing business? It might, in some circumstances. Will it mean that some projects will not go ahead because they're not going to get the consent? Yes. And by the way, it happens even today. There are mines that don't receive environmental assessment approval didn't receive it from the Harper government. If I may use those words without, you know, being turned into a pillar of salt or something. It's part of the process. It's part of an evolutionary process. And it's needs to involve the open discussion with industry, with First Nations, with governments, about how do we move forward effectively to ensure that we are in fact respecting the rights and obligations which are set out in our law, both domestic and international. And I personally think it's part and parcel of the social responsibility that we all have as Canadians to deal with what is, after all, one of the great pieces of unfinished business in our country. And that is how to more broadly effect a reconciliation between those who have been here for thousands of years and those who have come more recently with their ideas and values and institutions and companies and projects that have a very profound impact on the traditional territory of people who've been here for a long time. Does it involve change? Yes. Does it involve the creation of some new institutions and new ways of looking at our geography and our governance? Yes. Is it scary? Not in the least. It's exciting. Because it means that the time when we could have a development, as we had in Ontario, at the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century, the extraordinary impact that the nickel mines of the Sudbury Basin have had on our development as a province and on Canada's development as a country, we at least have to recognize one thing. They didn't do much for the people who were living there and who'd been there for a long time. They were not largely, by and large, they were not hired. Their bands did not get revenues from the resources. They did not benefit directly from this extraordinary development. They were, for the most part, marginalized. And we can't let that happen again. We can't let that continue to happen. And that, I think, is the nature of the change that that I'd like to see, and I hope that it's one that can be embraced by the people, the companies, and the governments that represent and work in this province and right across the country. So thank you very much for this opportunity. I know that Kyle will have some comments and questions and other issues to raise, but it's a great pleasure to be here. And I said jokingly it's going to be an exciting time to be a lawyer. I also think, and I say this to all of you, it's going to be an exciting time to be a miner. And don't worry. There isn't a lousy cycle that hasn't led to an uptick. There hasn't been one yet. And there is a cycle, but it will come back. And don't take short-term decisions as in your careers. Look long-term to the potential this country will always have as a center for economic activity and resource development. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, Bob, for that very eloquent overview of where we sit today in Canada and worldwide with respect to resource development and the issues that the industry faces, and as a country where we're going. You know, Bob touched on a number of important points that relate to us in the industry and what we do. At New Gold, we concluded Ontario's very first environmental assessment process on a major new mine just 12 months ago, and that was a 4-year process. We tried to harmonize it with the federal government, but really it was up to us as a company to do that and work with 16 Aboriginal groups within the Treaty 3 territory. Many of the areas that we were focusing on were areas that traditionally we would have expected as an industry that the Crown would be heavily involved with. And to Bob's point, the Crown was pretty absent in many areas. And so for us, it was up to us to meet the needs of the community as best as we could as a resource development company and understand those concerns. So as a resource company, when you're approaching a project, undoubtedly there's going to be Aboriginal groups involved that you're going to want to get to know and understand their concerns. And when you go to meet and when you go to understand them as a community and their cultural values and so on, there's going to be baggage in the room from the Crown's historic discrimination against Aboriginal groups in this country. And yesterday we saw a decision federally which squarely shows that that discrimination has been systemic for decades. So as an industry, we are improving. I got my start in the environmental field 20 years ago with Placer Dome, working at Musselwhite Mine, which was Ontario's first new gold mine in decades, in a pristine area that had been unimpacted by resource development. And the Aboriginal issues that I learned of at that time, 20 years ago, my first time going to a community, remote Aboriginal community, were no different than what I saw working in Niger and West Africa. I was telling Bob this before the presentation, in terms of lack of infrastructure, lack of social programs directly in the community, abject poverty, and systemic problems socially within the community. So as a company, I guess the first question I've got for Bob is, how do you see the Crown advancing industry's needs now that we're in this market down cycle and we're getting ready for that uptick, as you indicated, which will come eventually? It may take a little longer this time because the situation is different with China and the currency wars which are taking place. But how do you see the Crown engaging in a better manner here in Ontario? You cited some good examples in Nunavut, in other jurisdictions where they are moving forward. How do you see Ontario kind of improving the situation for the next uptick and getting that framework in place that you've been so heavily involved with over the last 3 years?
Well, I have to be careful not to be seen to be negotiating in public with the Crown, because we are in the middle of a negotiating process. But some things are matters of public knowledge. We have signed a regional framework agreement, we being the Matawa First Nations and the Government of Ontario. The regional framework agreement, which is you can find online, it's you can download it. It's relative, it's a very public document. Calls on the province of Ontario has accepted that there will be an environmental assessment process which will involve direct participation by First Nations. We're now negotiating the nature of that. And that's, as they say in these discussions, not necessarily the devil is in the details, but certainly everything is in the details of getting this right. The province has also accepted the logic of having a community benefit fund, which will directly benefit conditions and improve conditions on reserve, and we are obviously discussing infrastructure and community roads and other means of transportation, and improving the energy situation, improving the facilities for the internet, for broadband, making it possible for First Nations kids to be getting access to more information and more possibilities for remote education and other things that are very much part of what we need to do. So we are now negotiating the nature of that, and I think we'll see in the next few months the extent to which we can reach agreement, and the Crown will say, well, we're prepared to do these things, and here's the steps that we're going to take. And similarly, I think the federal government has indicated now that it wants to be part of this process, and also part of other processes around the country, which will result in direct benefit and improvement in the life situations affecting Aboriginal families. The events last week, I mean, we've had two major events in the last week. We've had the tragedy in La Loche, and we've had the impact of the human rights decision. And both of these events, when you take them together, point to the continuing need to look at the nature of life in First Nations communities across the country, to see what can be done to make improvements and take the steps that will be there to make improvements, and also create the opportunities for economic development. I'm not one of those people who believes that the First Nations who are living remotely are inevitably going to be living in communities that have absolutely nothing. There's no need for us to take that position. If the First Nation communities in Northern Ontario had received over time anything like the benefits which their connection to the land should have provided them with, there's no need for these communities to be in such poverty compared to where they've been. And what the human rights decision points to is the fact that there has been systemic discrimination. It's been the policy of the Government of Canada that they will not pay the same amount per capita for education and for child services and for pension, for anything. They will not pay the same amount to people living on reserve as they would pay to people who are living even in communities next door. Even, compare conditions in the First Nation called Arrowland with the conditions in a community called Nakina. And you say, these are communities living within 15 miles of each other. We're not talking about, saying, well, we have to have the same facilities as you have in downtown Toronto. That's not the comparison that we need to make. We need to be able to say, we're prepared to help to make communities livable, sustainable over time. And there, the private sector has a role to play as well. But I hear your frustration in saying that in the absence of strong leadership from the Crown, a lot of it has been left to companies to say, good. And the fact is the courts are increasingly saying to governments, you can't abandon your responsibility. You have to carry out your responsibility. That's what the NEB decision was all about, which is now leading to changes in the policies of the NEB, which were announced yesterday by Minister Carr. And they're all part of a development, saying the Crown can't just give up its responsibilities to companies and say, go off and get these things done. And the Crown has to continue to take a role.
Thanks, Bob. And I know over the course of your career, you've been a fighter for social justice your entire life. And I think that you took a strong stand in terms of Aboriginal self-government in the early 90s when you were Premier. And I know in speaking with Premier Wynne that she has very strong feelings in similar regard with Aboriginal peoples here in Ontario. How do you see the federal infrastructure, now that we have a federal government which is perhaps a little more amenable to working with our provincial partners and we're in this cycle where we need infrastructure spending. Where do you see the opportunity where this infrastructure spending that's coming, that we hear about from Mr. Morneau daily, can fill in some of those needs in terms of Aboriginal infrastructure, social development programs that can really help the largest growing demographic in the country and facilitate an economy that we can really be proud of going into the next century?
Well, I mean, I think I see the opportunities as being huge. I mean, the needs are very, very great. I mean, we know that there are well over 100 communities in the country that have boiled water advisories whose water systems are not working properly. We have schools that need to be built. We have people that are inadequately housed. We have the whole issue of transportation infrastructure. We have the question of extending reliable and sustainable electricity to communities. I mean, most of the communities in Northern Ontario, the remote communities, rely on diesel. I mean, it's if you wanted to do something that would impact greenhouse gas emissions and something that would also provide much more reliable sources of electricity for people, you deal with that as a government. You just say, we got to deal with this quickly. And that's just Ontario. But if you look across the country, there needs to be a program overall that says we're going to substitute for diesel across the country, and we're going to take the steps to initiate to get that done. It takes time, and it takes initiatives on the part of the federal government to do it, but it can be done. I want to come back to the one point that you made, which is, for me, shouldn't just be an assumption. It should be very clear. Sometimes governments say, well, this development is not happening at the speed with which we thought it would, so we're going to pull back too. That would be really short-sighted. It would be really short-sighted because the fact of the matter is you're not going to have effective development unless you've created the conditions that make it possible for First Nations to benefit from the development. And that requires a partnership with First Nations, and it requires a series of investments that governments have not been prepared to make yet. That is what needs to happen. And I think the industry itself should be very positive about that. And I hesitate even to get into the subject of deficits, since I'm sort of the poster boy for deficits across the country. It seems to have lingered long past my time in political office, as if I either invented them or am the last person to have ever had one. But I think we need to understand this is a time when governments need to be prepared to invest. It is the classic moment in time when that makes sense. And if you simply say, well, we're only going to invest when the economy is working at high speed, then you just aren't doing the job that governments are supposed to do. And you're not creating the conditions that will actually lead to more investment. The central, I think, when you look back at the last few years and the failure of the Cliffs initiative, the underlying challenge for resource development in a lot of Canada is, how do you get there? How do you get there? How do you get the people there? And how do you get the materials out? And how do you get them to market? It's the problem of the oil and gas industry. It's the problem of a lot of mineral possibilities and mineral potential. There are a lot of places around the world that have mining potential. If you talk to the industry, they'll say, oh, there's a potential find here, the potential here, potential there, lots of possibilities. If you can't get there, and you can't get the goods out, then it's always going to be there as a potential. But that's the reality. And the reality of our country is that, we are an infrastructure country. We're a country that has had, since the beginning of our history, has had to deal with the question of, well, how do we create the networks that will allow us to get there? And that is how we have to continue to see this, with the addition that we also have to understand that extension of infrastructure requires the direct participation of First Nations and direct consultation with First Nations to make sure that that's exactly what they want. Because if they don't want that, then there needs to be a further conversation about what what can be done to ensure appropriate living conditions for people.
Thanks for that, Bob. You know, you mentioned climate change in a kind of a indirect way when you talked about road access for the remote communities. Climate change is obviously one of the key issues we're going to face globally going forward. It's been recognized widely as something that industry needs to prepare for. Within the mining industry, we are doing certain things to make sure that we're tracking our carbon emissions, trying to reduce carbon emissions. But there's a coming together of environmental issues together with the need for Aboriginal respect and working closely with Aboriginal communities, respecting new decisions from the courts. It's making us take longer to make decisions. How do you see that longer time frame? And when you talk to people in the Anishinaabe community or in Treaty 3 or any of these communities, they talk about 7 generations and consensus-based decision making. You know, in companies, we sit around a table and we make a decision. And we're traded in the public sphere on the stock market. And we're competing to make sure that we are able to raise the funds necessary. It's a time is of the essence issue. On the other side of it, we have Indigenous peoples the world over which take a longer view. So there is this evolution going on between companies coming to understand the rhythms of Indigenous people worldwide. If you go back far enough, we're all Indigenous people from someplace. So there's a commonality there that we need to go back to. How do you see taking this opportunity? This is a bit of a convoluted question, but I think you get where I'm coming from here. In terms of the time is of the essence issue of a publicly traded company, how are you seeing some of the firms that you've been working with sort of evolving and coming to understand that longer time frame and working within it so that we can prepare, again, going back to this next cycle question again, are you seeing that evolutionary kind of movement coming forward? It's something that, you know, I've seen firsthand in the environmental side for 20 years in the industry and kind of fighting against certain people that, you know, didn't necessarily want to take that next step. But I think that we're starting to see better movements in that direction. What have you seen in your work?
Well, I see a real problem, a challenge. I mean, I've, over time, I guess over my life, I've learned to say, well, how do you turn a problem into a challenge which you can then deal with? We're dealing with essentially 3 different clocks. The company's clock is based on how quickly can they get financing, how quickly can they make decisions, how quickly can they eliminate uncertainty, and you know, how quickly can they begin to get the revenues that they will require to justify the extensive investment that's been made to build a project. And these are real-time issues, and these are issues that mean that a project will either go or it won't go. And so that's one clock. And I would say the clock is even more intense for a junior mining company that is developing a project, but is not necessarily going to be completing the project. And there, the tenuous link is with capital markets that say, if we ain't got certainty, you ain't got money. And if you ain't got money, you ain't got a project. And, you know, time to wrap it up. And that pressure is being felt all the time. It's being felt by the companies, the smaller companies that are at work in Northern Ontario every day. Then there's government time, which is not the same as company time, as companies will perhaps recognize what I'm saying. And government time has a lot to do with election cycles, budget cycles, their own cycles. And so they'll frequently make decisions either more quickly or more slowly, depending on where they see themselves sitting in that cycle. And then you have another clock, which is the Indigenous clock, which says, well, we're ready for help on housing, and we're ready for help on getting moving in the community, but we need time to deal with the issues that are important to us, precisely because this generation in Anishinaabe country is very, very conscious of the fact that they're making decisions about development that will impact the nature of life in the communities. If a community is no longer a remote community, it changes the nature of life in the community. Now, my view is that, and it's not what I think, it's my assessment is that the younger generation in many, many communities is ready to make this decision. But it's a contested issue, and part of it's contested because of time. And so a great deal of what I have to do as a negotiator is, first of all, put the 3 clocks on the table and say, hey, you know what? These 3 clocks are different. Yours says this time, that says this time, this says this time. And we got to figure out how to find a way through this so that, you know, we're dealing with the realities of the 3 separate clocks. And I face that every day. I mean, that's very much part of what I face. Government saying, got to have this done, ready in time for this. And you sort of say, well, that actually is your timetable. It's not the timetable of the people that I've been asked to represent. You have to understand they have a different timetable. And people can often not hear the fact that, you know, even the clocks are contested, even the time frame is contested. And that's important for people to hear that and understand culturally how different that can be.
And I think that, you know, looking at Alberta today, we're all learning it, you know, how taking the longer term view in comparison with some of the Scandinavian countries, particularly Norway and its development of oil resources, taking that longer term view pays off better dividends in the long term. And it's not something that Canada has done incredibly well for very long, certainly not recently in the resource sector. So I appreciate that your discussions are focusing on taking that longer term Aboriginal view so that we can end up with projects that are more sustainable, that can probably sustain downturns in the market. I mean, right now in the gold sector, we're racing towards the lowest cost producer in kind of the doldrums of gold prices. When I was at Musselwhite in the late 90s, the gold price was under $300 an ounce and our cash costs were $325. And the mine manager got a call from head office and said, are you ready to shut down next week? And he said, well, it's going to be a little rough, but yeah. So a lot of us young guys, young engineers, young scientists said, this is not a good place to be. Taking that longer term view, today Musselwhite's doing pretty well in this gold price environment. They've been competitive in their pricing. But that longer term clock that you have such a high responsibility over, I think is vital for companies to really understand, and for you as students now and industry leaders later, to understand getting out of school that this is a clock that you're going to have to think very hard about when you're thinking about a project. It's not going to happen. You know, 1 + 1 doesn't always equal 2. It's going to equal +5 or -25 if you do it the wrong way. So I guess that leads to my final question, maybe before we open it up to the audience, which is, where do you see us, Bob, in 5, 10 years' time as a country with this growing demographic, with an industry that's maybe pulling up again? Where do you see us in terms of the national sentiment and companies that are progressive?
Well, I don't make predictions so much as express hopes. I mean, the future really is in our hands. We can, make very little progress because we're not prepared to really address and confront the differences and the different opinions and figure out a way of reconciling them and bringing them together. Or we can, in fact, make quite a lot of progress. And I would argue that there's lots of evidence across the country that companies are prepared to negotiate, companies are prepared to connect and to relate. Governments are beginning to understand the fact that they can't do business simply the same way they did it in 10 or 15 or 20 years ago. They have to change. Mr. Trudeau has certainly embraced that at the national level. Premier Wynne has certainly embraced it at the provincial level. The question is, are governments prepared to walk the talk? Are they prepared to actually do what they say they know needs to happen? And only time will tell. And I do believe there's some real opportunities here for us as a country. And I do also think that there's a shifting mood in the First Nations themselves. There's a new generation of leadership in First Nations communities which is looking a lot more pragmatically and practically at what needs to be done to create conditions that will actually improve life and condition on reserve. And the way I would put it is to say the last 50 years have been spent in winning a whole series of court and other political and legal battles that have clearly signaled a shift in the presence and respect for Aboriginal rights and title. The question in the next 50 years will increasingly be about how are you going to exercise the leverage that you now have to get the improvements in conditions and the improvements in life opportunities that your previous generation fought so hard to get established in law and in practice across the country. And that really is the issue that I see in the forefront. And I hope very much, I hope that we can actually get there as we look at the possibilities for future development.
I certainly hope so too. Thanks for that, Bob. I guess we're going to open it up maybe to some questions now. I think we've got some time. So there's microphones in the aisles here if you'd like to step up.
My name is Merrick Patrick. I work for CHO Hill here in Toronto. I appreciate the presentation. My question is partially a comment. I was thinking there's a fourth clock to the clock analogy you were describing, and that is perception of international companies, coming here to, so to speak, post up in Canada and develop, whether it be for, it's mining, but I'm seeing a lot on the West Coast in terms of the LNG development and European international companies finding it to be that there are too many hurdles to be jumped through. There's corporate responsibility and social responsibility, but there's a fine line between that and all the hurdles that eventually companies are going to say, you know what, we're going to go somewhere else. So what are your thoughts on that as it pertains to mining in Ontario, Canada, and whether that's a crucial fourth clock that we as Canadians should be considering?
Well, I think the question of global perception is always something which is a reality that we have to deal with. And if the perception is that you cannot get to agreements, then yes, that will have a negative impact on the potential for investment. I also think that perception is false. There are lots of areas where we have agreements. I am very familiar with the Pacific Trails Pipeline in British Columbia because I've been involved as an advisor to the First Nations Limited Partnership, which is 16 First Nations that have reached an agreement with Chevron. The holdup there, we have environmental approval. We have 16 First Nations that have agreed. What we don't have is a company that's right at the moment is prepared to make a final investment decision.
$20 billion.
And that's, well, $35 billion. And that's because of the size of the investment and the uncertainty around price. And can they get customers who are prepared to pay them a price which will, in fact, make for a profitable endeavor? It is not about, Cliff's departure from Ontario, regardless of what some might say in a newspaper article, it had nothing to do with the government of Ontario and had nothing to do with the First Nations. It had to do with the ability of the company to persuade its board that the size of the investment that was going to be required should be made and that the company had the means to do that. And they discovered, as many of us do in life, that sometimes there is more good ideas than there is money. And it might have been a good idea, but if there's no money, then nothing's going to happen. And I think industry has to fess up here. We have to understand that in mining, the critical issue in mining today in Canada is not the challenge of First Nations agreements. It's not what governments do or don't do. It's whether or not you have a market for something. I gave you the example of the hydro project as a way of trying to dispel the notion that these negotiations have to go on forever. They don't. They go on forever if a company doesn't have the means to conclude the negotiation. And they go on forever if a government is not really serious about making progress on self-government and making progress on Aboriginal empowerment. They don't have to go on forever. And we can deal with this perception issue pretty quickly when companies and governments are willing to step up to the plate. What's holding investment back in Canada today is the fact that the commodities markets are in the tank. And we need to have the honesty to at least say that and say, this is an opportunity to repair any of the issues that we may have, but let's not pretend that that's the central problem that we're facing in terms of getting to final investment decisions across the country. because I don't believe that's the case.
It's interesting, just to add to that, there's an interesting distinction between energy and the minerals extractive industry as well in terms of perception that I've been exposed to. I did some work for Shell Oil when I was a consultant in British Columbia, and the approach that's taken in terms of Aboriginal engagement, certainly by Shell at that time, almost 12 years ago, was pretty rudimentary. And I think we've seen a bit of a shift in that today, and prices are going to hopefully accelerate that shift in attitude towards Aboriginal groups, but it's an observation. We've got another question here. Someone's been waiting.
I'll just put it down a bit. My name is Marilyn Spank, and I'm an engineer, and I think there's quite a few others in the group. We're representing the Ontario Society of Professional Engineers. We thought this was an important event to attend. Can you guys put your hands up? We're few and far between here. Anyways, just my own personal question, as I would like to hear your thoughts on the similarities or differences that you see between what Finland has done in the development of their chromite deposits in their far north. And I realize this may not be a very fair question to you if you're not familiar with their operations. I worked there as a summer student years ago when I first started my metallurgical engineering career, and I would argue that Finland is more isolated from their market than Canada is. And I would say that Finland has similar Arctic climate and infrastructure issues as Ontario, and they also need to address issues of concern to their Indigenous people, the Lappish Indigenous people. So what do you see, in terms of the similarities and differences? I sort of think of this little tiny country trapped between a body of water and Russia, and they added huge value by developing stainless steel. They didn't just go for chromite. They, and so I just would like to kind of get some of your thoughts.
Well, there's a lot of differences. I mean, just as Kyle was referring to the Norwegians, I mean, Canada should look at Norway and what the difference in the path that we've taken, Canada and Alberta and Saskatchewan and Norway, in the last 50 years, and weep. Because, and it's not just about pointing fingers at the government of Alberta or any provincial government. It's everybody. We have not added enough value to what we have on the ground, and we have not set aside the revenues from that development in a way that will allow us to diversify our economy and save for a rainy day. We've not saved the money, and the Norwegians have. The Finns have had a much more integrated view about industrial development and a much more integrated view about the role of their companies, whether it's in forestry, where, again, the Finns have taken their forest industry and created an industry out of the environmental impacts of forestry and the most up-to-date paper-making machinery and other forms of machinery. They've also created an international furniture industry in Scandinavia more broadly, and we can hardly claim to have done the same thing. IKEA is not a Canadian company. It now uses Canadian wood products, but all the elements of design and other things were put in place have been put in place by them. So there is a world of difference in terms of the companies, the countries seeing this development of this industry as a national project, one that requires a coherent industrial strategy, as well as a coherent infrastructure strategy, and a coherent strategy with respect to relations with the Aboriginal First Nations people. We don't have the same approach as a country or as a province. And you could argue that, well, we also have lower taxes. So, people say, well, yeah, but we don't want to have Finnish taxes. We want to have our own level of taxation. And I say that because it's important to remember that when you look at the Norwegian example, they have a value-added tax which is well over 20%. And that value-added tax, which is equivalent of our HST, has been in place throughout the entire time of their resource development. They have not relied on resource development for revenues to pay for their daily operations as a government. They made a decision to say we will maintain our level of taxes, and we will maintain our consumer taxes and our income taxes and our corporate taxes, and we will use the money that comes in from the revenue from the resource industry and put it into a fund, which now has close to $1 trillion in the fund.
Do you think that the Ring of Fire Development Corporation would help us to start thinking that way? Is that what the purpose of it is? 'Cause
No, I think the DevCo that's been created by the government, the idea is simply a vehicle which will be involved in the development of the infrastructure going forward. But there's still a lot of, there still needs to be a clearer direction with respect to how that's going to happen and what the impact will be. Whether, but to take it to the next step with respect to building a stainless steel industry and all the other impacts that that can have, we've allowed the Canadian steel industry to virtually not disappear, but certainly facing enormous challenges as it goes forward.
Just while we're waiting for another question, I mean, it touches on the whole idea of social programs and funding social programs. And in Scandinavia, obviously, they take a very serious long-term approach to making sure that social programs are well funded. And I think where the rubber hits the road in Canada, frankly, is when you end up in the emergency room of a Canadian hospital. And you see that in many emergency rooms, anywhere in the country, ostensibly, they're having difficulty. And whether you're Aboriginal or Canadian, you end up in the same place. So you have to ask yourself, when you're spending that money or you're increasing that taxation level to fund the social programs, is it overall better? And I would argue that it is. And the Scandinavian view is that longer-term clock that you talked about, Bob. So it's an interesting comparison. Good question, I think.
But just on that point, and just to say, make it very clear, the First Nations are not asking for new social programs.
No.
They're asking for the same social programs
Yeah.
that other Canadians have access to,
Absolutely.
and that they do not have access to because of how they have been treated and how the Crown has interpreted the nature of its obligation to them. The Crown fought the case in the Human Rights Tribunal for 10 years. And during that time, the Crown's argument was, how much we spend on reserve is our business. And we're not bound by a rule that says you have to spend the same amount per capita as you provinces and the taxpayers spend in non-Aboriginal communities. And the Human Rights Tribunal has said that argument won't do, because the impact of your policy means that one group of Canadians does not have any similarity of their access to child family services as another group of Canadians who actually live right next door. So you got a problem, because what you're doing is systematically discriminatory. And that's what's important about that decision.
Agreed. Very good.
Derek Ream with Lundin Mining, based here in Toronto. Thank you both for a very interesting session. I really enjoyed it. The answer to my question may be implicit in the remarks you've made, but I got the opportunity, so I'll ask it anyway. FPIC, whenever the discussion starts around the table, one of the central issues that comes up is whether the word consent implies a veto to those groups who are affected by a proposed development, mining or otherwise. I just want, I appreciate your insight on that specific question.
Well, I think the question, the related question to that is, who is the group that is giving consent or not giving consent? And there, I think, needs to be a discussion within First Nations themselves as to say, well, are we really saying that if we had a proposal that 15 First Nations agreed to and one First Nation did not, that there would then be no proposal, there'd be no development? Is that what we're saying? And I don't think that is what people are saying. I don't think that's coherent. I think you need to define, and our laws and our processes need to define, what is the First Nation, what is the entity that has to give approval, and what is the process by which they have to give approval. In other words, if it's the chief who stands up and says, I don't want this to happen, and it won't happen, I think there's a legitimate argument to say, well, we need to have in a clear sense of what the protocols are that lead to a legitimate process that gets us to where we need to get to. I've seen lots of agreements between First Nations and companies where there's a dispute resolution mechanism built into the agreement that says where the parties can't agree, there will be third-party determination as to how to resolve the differences between the parties. So I don't see the concept of consent as being as troubled as some people do, the use of the word veto. I think it's really about, is the First Nation government, once there has been a clear establishment of a government within, I would suggest, a broader community than just one reserve or two reserves. I think you're looking at a broader understanding than that. Is this a level of government that needs to consent to a major development? The answer is yes, it is. But I think there's a pushback that says, well, then what is your process to get to that consent? Because it can't just be somebody standing up and saying, I don't like this, it's not going to happen. It's got to be a process that everybody can say, okay, that's legitimate. That's a legitimate expression of your community's and community broadly defined opinion about what development should take place.
You talked about, my name is Olivia, I'm from Hatch, we're a consulting company in the mining sector. And I wanted you to elaborate, if you could, a bit on the government investments that you were talking about. A lot of the barriers that I've seen around education, and even if a community wants to participate, there's some difficulty there. So I was wondering if that's something that you're seeing more of the government focusing on when you talk about providing these services and where the gaps have been historically. I know Paul Martin has also been doing a lot of work in that area.
That's an important question.
Well, I think we've all paid a price for the level of neglect and isolation. And I think we're continuing to pay the price of neglect and isolation. Neglect in terms of systematic unfunding and frankly not thinking through what are we going to do with policy. So for example, there's now an inquest underway in Thunder Bay, which is dealing with the deaths of a number of adolescent Aboriginals in the city of Thunder Bay who were coming down to the city to go to high school, because for most of the reserve population, there is no high school in their community. So what governments have done is, over many years, what public policy has done is to say, okay, we'll set up these reserves, and that's where people will go. And we'll tell people that's where they have to live in order to receive, benefits from the government, get housing and the rest of it. But they haven't followed through and said, and so now what? What are you going to do now? Are you going to create housing and jobs? We're like, what are you doing? You're creating all these communities, because effectively they've been created by governments over a long period of time, and based on trading posts and traditional places where people stayed. But you now have to say, okay, what are we doing with these places? And I think this is something that requires real discussion in the country. What's the plan? And yes, it's education, it's health, it's what are we doing for seniors? It's the appalling cost that's involved in saying, well, we're going to transport all kinds of folks out of the communities and put them into hospital in Thunder Bay and nursing homes in Thunder Bay, and their families can't see them, and they don't see their families. You go down the list of things, you just sort of say, people haven't thought this through. Are these places where we expect people to be born? Most of The births that take place in the far north take place in Thunder Bay or Sioux Lookout. And the fathers are not there. So you sort of say, what exactly are we doing? Like, what's happening here? And I think the price that we're paying for this neglect is huge. And this generation of young people are not going to put up with this level of mistreatment. And some of what happens is implosion, suicide. And some of it is explosion, as we saw last week, in terms of the violence. And we need to understand these events are not accidents. They are the consequence of a long history of neglect and frankly, a lack of, to use a phrase, a word that's coming back into vogue, mindfulness. What are we doing? What are we actually doing? Think through the life cycle of every family, of every human being, and say, are we creating communities that are sustainable? And how do we sustain them? Knowing that there will also be a natural process which has taken place over the last 50 years where young people, vote with their feet and say, I'm not getting a job here, I'm not getting education here, I'm not getting what I need here, I need to go into town or somewhere else. So Regina and Winnipeg and Saskatoon and Thunder Bay, Aboriginal population in Thunder Bay is now 25% of the population of Thunder Bay. And that number will continue to grow. It's the fastest growing population in the country. The emigration out of off reserve into cities is as big a deal as immigration is from the rest of the world. We have refugees coming in out of communities, and we don't welcome them the same way. We don't have big ceremonies saying we're welcoming these kids coming into schools. And we need to think through all these things. What are we doing to deal with the human reality of these communities? And you can't expect a company to solve all these problems on its own, but you can expect, them to play a role, and for governments to play a role that they have to play, and for First Nations to play a role, and for there to be a real discussion about what are we doing about these conditions that have been created. And we're just starting that conversation.
I think to Bob's point, Mario and Draghi talked about a Marshall Plan for dealing with the Ukrainian crisis and the migrants that are coming out of Ukraine. We have our own need for a Marshall Plan in this country in terms of how we're going to deal with the issues you talked about. We talked about one of the success stories, Musselwhite, many Aboriginal people that have homes in Thunder Bay, that purchase new cars, go back to the communities, practice their traditional lifestyles, hunting and fishing and so on, and have that connection to the land, but it involves a good economy, making sure that there's employment.
Yeah, I don't think it's an either-or proposition, the reserve structure, traditional communities, and urban living. I think the reality is that people maintain a very strong connection to their homeland and to their Aboriginal identity. Yes. And there was an article in Maclean's magazine this week by a guy called Scott Gilmore saying, let's just get everybody off reserves and get the kids into the big cities, and let's not pretend we can do anything with these remote communities. That is actually just wrong. It's just flat out wrong for people who are wandering around with these the ideas in their heads. It's just we've tried that. We've tried residential schools. We've tried all kinds of ways of assimilating and dragging people away from their homes and their home. It's been a disaster. It's been an absolute catastrophe. So let's try something else. And it isn't that. And the idea that this is some sort of a novel new policy is just ridiculous. We've been doing it for hundreds of years, and it's had an absolutely catastrophic effect.
Thank you for sharing your insights and experiences with CSR, First Nations, and mining in Canada. This has been a very great talk. So thank you so much, Bob and Kyle.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I enjoyed it. Thank you.
Small token of appreciation for you. Thank you, everyone, for attending. Our next speaker in this series will be Jennifer Mackey, CEO of Valley Base Metals. She will be coming on April 12th to speak about navigating turbulent times in the base metals industry. So I hope you can join us for that talk. And also, I welcome you to stay here for a light lunch that we have out just outside the doors here. So thanks, everyone, for coming.